To get the Crime Writers on After Show right now, go to patreon.com/partnersincrimemedia.
I'm Rebecca Lavoie, and this is Crime Writers On. Crime Writers On is the original true crime review podcast that digs into true crime, pop culture, other podcasts. And on this episode, he left his child in the back seat of a hot car. He said it was a tragic accident. The police said it was calculated murder. We'll go back to our 2016 discussion of Breakdown from host Bill Rankin and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Joining me to get that done and more is true crime author, TV journalist, and host of These Are Their Stories podcast, my husband and the love of my life, Kevin Flynn. Hello, Kevin.
Hello, Rebecca.
So, Kevin, what are we about to hear on today's CWO Classic Rewind?
Okay, well, on Mondays, we're going to be talking about Season 11 of Breakdown, which just happens to be the swan song for
Mr. Bill Rankin.
Mr. Bill Rankin. So today we're going back to our May 7th, 2016 discussion of Season 2 of Breakdown, Death in a Hot Car. Now, I just want to point out that, first of all, there was this delay in the trial, which threw off the release schedule for the podcast. And we did talk about Breakdown a couple different times on Crime Writers On, but this was our most extensive discussion. As you can see, the episode's not terribly long here, but I think you'll see where we came in on these early podcasts of Breakdown from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.
All right, let's take a listen. So, big news yesterday. There was a big breakdown on the podcast Breakdown, an unexpected twist in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's podcast about the Justin Ross Harris case. Kevin, do you want to tell us what happened there?
Yeah, well, as you know, if you've been following the podcast, that right now they are in jury selection for the Harris trial. This is the guy who was accused of leaving his son to die in the back of his hot car while he was distracted, sexting and doing other things, and there's the allegation that he wanted to be childless and left his son alone to die in the car on purpose. Now, the defense made a motion 3 weeks into jury selection saying that they didn't think Harris could get a fair trial based on, among other things, the intense media coverage, including Breakdown, that's looking, into all sort of the aspects of the case, the legal system surrounding everything from how jurors are selected in this county to psychologists looking into the phenomenon of leaving children in cars. So, very unexpectedly, the judge granted a motion to change venues to someplace else in the state of Georgia.
Now, Laura, these kind of motions get made all the time. You worked on cases that went to trial. Have you ever seen a change of venue get granted before?
No. And I worked on a high-profile case where they tried to get a change of venue, and it wasn't even close to happening. So I was in Williamsburg last week, which in Virginia also happens to be the home of the National Center for State Courts. And according to them, trial relocations like this are so rare, they don't even keep statistics.
Wow.
Now, sometimes I actually think that there is a good case for a trial relocation. A recent example of that we talked about a lot in this house was the trial of the Boston Marathon bomber, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. And if you live in New England, you know that everybody knew about that case, obviously, and had an opinion about that case. Kevin, what did you think when you heard that this trial got relocated?
I was gobsmacked because I've never heard of any of those motions being granted. I can't think of a trial that they changed the venue on. If anyone I ever thought it would be, I thought it would be the Boston Marathon bomber, that they would move it to Springfield, Massachusetts, which is about 2 hours down the Mass Turnpike. But in the other sense, I'm not surprised at the rationale, because if you've been listening to Breakdown and you listen to the voir dire of the jurors, it seems very unlikely that there was going to be a jury that would be impartial.
Now, Toby, I'd love your take on that, because I know that you were listening to Breakdown and you heard Bill Rankin's analysis of not only the venue, the actual county where the trial was going to be held, but the way the people think there, the way that other, trials have gone. And then we also heard that voir dire. Do you think that Harris was going to get an impartial jury in that county and get a fair trial in that county?
I think he makes a pretty strong case that that's like a quote unquote law and order county where the prosecutors are confident they're going to get convictions in cases. So I think it would have been a tough place for the defendant. Just the fact that they were saying, and I can't remember exactly who said it in the podcast, but that there wasn't one person who seemed predisposed to find him not guilty, that everybody who expressed an opinion expressed that they were guilty. It's interesting you bring up the Boston Marathon bomber. My thought about the reason why that wouldn't have gotten changed, whereas this one would have, is that I think the Boston Marathon bomber, it was really a crime against a community. And I think moving it away from that community probably would have been inappropriate. They wouldn't have been able to find justice from within the community that was harmed. Whereas in this case, it's either an incredibly tragic accident or an incredibly cruel murder. But I'm not sure that the community has been harmed by this. So moving it to a different location, I don't think really undermines justice at all. And it probably gives him a better chance of having people sort of approach the case without very strong feelings, because it's the kind of case that's going to bring out very strong feelings.
Now, see, Toby, I actually disagree with you. I think that if somebody commits a crime against a community, that community is the wrong place to have that trial. I mean, you wouldn't, for example, have the family members of a victim on the jury of the person who,
hold it in their living room.
Exactly. What do you think about that idea, Kevin?
Well, I understand what Toby's saying, but, all crimes are actually against the community, the people. It's the state of versus. It's the people versus. So a crime against one person is a crime against all of us. That's why the prosecution represents all of us.
And Boston, by the way, made a choice to make that crime against the community. I mean, that was the messaging around that crime was very much about Boston. I mean, we had like 3 people who died, lots of people injured, but immediately it was the Boston. I mean, Boston has sort of a spirit of owning things that happen in that city, making it their thing. I think even more so than other cities where things happen. But
New York, Oklahoma City. I mean, there's you're right. There was, in the wake of that, the whole Boston Strong thing, and
that was the slogan around.
That was the slogan, and it was like, even if you lived in Revere and you never ran a mile in your life, you took it very personally. It does speak to a larger issue that you don't have to have a jury made up of people that know nothing about the case. You have to have a jury of people who are willing to set aside any knowledge that they may have and listen impartially. You can sit through a lot of jury trials and through jury selection and get a sense like, this one's better than average, this one's worse than average. This one, just from the reporting that we got from Breakdown, just seemed like there was just no way possible they're going to start with a jury that is going to listen without prejudice. I mean, that was the setup for, I think, the final 2 episodes leading up to the trial, is that you can win it or lose it right here, and it seemed like they're going to lose it.
Laura, have you ever had a case where jury selection was just really tough and you just felt like, this is not going to go the defense's way because people were getting in that you felt were not going to be good jurors and you just weren't feeling good about it on the voir dire side?
Not so much. I mean, most of the cases, like I said, I worked on a few high-profile cases, but most of the cases I was on were smaller cases, so it wouldn't have been something where the jury was as critical as a case like this.
Now, let's talk about the media for a second. The cases that you worked on that were high profile, do they have a lot of media coverage?
Yes.
Do you feel like the media coverage does make a difference in a defendant's ability to receive a fair trial?
Well, I think it depends, like Kevin was saying, it kind of depends on the mindset of the juror, because there's certain cases that everybody is going to know something about because they have been in the media. But in this case, in Breakdown, it was pretty obvious that it didn't matter how much media coverage there had been, and there was a lot. These people already had such preconceived ideas. And I mean, it's such a horrible case that there was no way that they were going to be impartial, no matter what they did or didn't know about the case, just because of the nature of the case.
Right.
It's such a unique crime, too, in the sense that, if it were a shooting or a stabbing or something like that, people would kind of, I don't want to be blasé about it, but they know what they're getting into. And you could probably say, he killed his wife, or he killed whomever, or she killed. I think it's kind of the thing that you might expect to be confronted with if you're called for jury duty. This is such an unusual case, whereas, there are questions as to whether or not he intended to do this. And even if he didn't intend to do this, what is his criminal liability? Because it's a crime against a child, it just inflames so many more passions than even your, I hate to put it this way, your run-of-the-mill homicide, that it just seemed that people were coming in just ready to hang them.
There have been cases that I've worked on where we knew there was going to be a lot of publicity. And so part of my job as an investigator was to set up a Google alert or whatever news alert that I was going to use and track and compile copies of all media coverage of a case, and also including comments. We have some newspapers where there's like open comment sections and people can go in. And that's something that's also, as you're looking through the people that are on the potential juror list, to find out if there are people that were commenting on these stories that are then in the jury pool.
That's really interesting. Toby, What did you think of the judge's statement about the media coverage of the case? She mentioned Breakdown specifically, which I thought was very interesting. And she talked about, the call-in talk show that had a 2-hour open line talk show about the case. And then she also said, of course, it's the media's right to cover this if they think that it's an important story, but ... What did you think of that section where we heard the judge making that statement? And did she mean it when she said it's the media's right, or was she in some way maybe blaming the media, or was she just trying to get out of it? Because there was a lot of heat on her in the moment. I don't know. I was sort of stuck in the middle of wondering what she was thinking there.
Well, I think it's a realistic stance to take, which is that the local public is already kind of inflamed on this. I think I kind of respect it because I think, and we've seen this in the things that we've watched to do this podcast, but there's quite often, if it plays to the advantage of the prosecution, you just kind of go with it. So that if there was a situation in which the jury pool was going to be slanted towards the prosecution, that the temptation might be to just let it ride. And the fact that she was able to kind of make a determination, which I think would be fairly unpopular in that county. And I don't know whether judges are elected in Georgia.
I'm not sure. I don't know. But, I found myself thinking, and Kevin, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, that there's a lot more attention on what's happening in the courtroom now that we have this podcast that has been, at one point, I think it was number 5 on the overall iTunes charts. I mean, there's probably a couple million people at least who have heard this case, part of this story. And do you think there could be incentive there just to say, you know what, we don't want this playing out this publicly in this courtroom?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I don't think that the issue in the real world, the real factual issue, the reason why there is a problem with this jury, I don't think has anything to do with the media coverage today. I think it was all the media coverage in the past, and that just sort of the flavor of the community is such that they are in the mood for retribution. Now, look, Justin Ross Harris is not a likable person. He has a lot of other problems going on. So even if he was completely unaware that his child was in the backseat and is not criminally responsible for his death, there's a whole lot of other shit on this guy. And it makes it very easy to not like him and want to throw the book at him for the death of his son. So that is sort of like the gasoline on this fire. Breakdown's doing a great job. I think I haven't obviously looked at all the media coverage, but, as opposed to just another 1 minute and 30-second package on the local TV news, Breakdown is going very deep into not just all of the facts surrounding the case and picking out, long versions of these sound bites so that you can really digest them, but looking at some of the other bigger societal issues, the psychological issues involved with that. So to not just take it at face value that it's impossible to forget about your child in the car, because there was a public awareness campaign at the time because so many people had done that.
Well, I want to ask that question. we haven't dug into this case at all. Toby, do you think that it's possible to have your baby be in the backseat of the car and forget your baby's there? I'm not asking you to speculate on whether or not Justin Harris knew, but do you think that it's possible just to forget? Could you imagine that happening to you?
That's 2 different questions. I can't imagine it happening to me, but I'll tell you why I think it could happen, which is, Malcolm Gladwell wrote an article in the New Yorker a number of years ago about car accidents. And one of the things that he talked about was about how you intake so much stimulus just every second of the day that your brain makes shortcuts on things, and especially things that you do routinely. So if you take the same route to work all the time, your brain is focusing on certain things and ignoring other things that it considers unimportant or superfluous. He was talking about how, sometimes people will be like turning in and they'll hit a pedestrian and they'll say, oh, I didn't even see him. And that's accurate because basically what your brain is doing is it's filling in that spot without you actually looking at it and taking it in. So I could see where somebody, if the routine is not to have your kid in the car with you, especially if he's distracted because he's sexting with teenagers, that your brain may just fill in the gaps for you. And you walk away and it doesn't occur to you until later. That's the only way I can see it happening, is that kind of thing. My kids were loud enough that there was no way.
Well, I think all the time about the times that I have the kind of drive to work where like I hit like a split in the highway and I always go left. But there have been times where I'm supposed to go right to go to a meeting or whatever, and I go left anyway, because it's just the way that I always go. And, you don't realize it until you're where you're supposed to be. And I know that Bill Rankin talked about that and the brain science behind it on the show. And, obviously it's not the same as leaving a kid in the car, but there is a thing around routine that makes me believe that it is possible that some people do this by accident. But here's the rub in this case. And Kevin, you talked about this, about what kind of person Justin Ross Harris is. It makes me think, and Laura, I want to ask you about this. It makes me think about the prosecution in the staircase. Remember how the prosecution made hay with Michael Peterson's, how they characterized it as bad behavior because he was bisexual, because he had porn on his computer.
This filth.
Yeah,
this filth is what they
exactly.
said. Yeah.
And because, he had had that brief communication with the prostitute who, by the way, he told how much he loved his wife too, which was like a whole other twist. Laura, how much do you think it does change a case when there are character things you can bring into it? Do you think that if Justin Ross Harris was like a super duper guy that we'd even be hearing about this trial at all?
Probably not. But again, you have to remember, not all that stuff is going to come in. But they talked about this in the podcast, about how that's why they have the dual theories of prosecution here, the two charges. They're going to be able to bring it in under the malice charge because they're going to say it's going towards his intent. I mean, I've had lots of cases where there's been people where you've had horrible bad facts and the person is, you look at that and you think this is awful if the jury finds out about this. But a lot of times motions are filed to keep that information out because it is going to prejudice the jury in the case if it's not directly relevant to proving one of the charges. But in this case, this guy just has so many issues. It's hard not to judge him when you hear all the information about him. It's really hard to step back and try to be more objective.
Laura, I'm curious to know, I know that you only started listening to the podcast because we sort of twisted your arm into it. I know the case has sort of some rough subject matter to it. I'm curious to know what you think of Bill Rankin's telling of the story. He's a newspaper reporter. He has a background, not dissimilar from yours in that way. He admits that he's like not a radio guy. He has a very sort of easygoing, non-narrative style of narration where he just sort of is, kind of telling you what's going on and making fun of the way that voir dire is pronounced there in the South. What do you think of the podcast? What we're learning about the law in Georgia? What we're hearing about this trial? I'm curious to know your thoughts overall.
Yeah. So this was a hard one for me to start. When I was a defense investigator, the cases that I always had the hardest time with were cases involving crimes against children. And a lot of times I would actually say, I can't work on this case. Once you have a child, your perspective definitely changes. And so it was hard for me to start listening to this. But I really like his delivery. He's very easy to listen to. And he, inserts little bits of humor along the way. Like he made a funny little sentence inserted about the free Wi-Fi at the court, or something last week. And
what is this sequestered juror going to do with Wi-Fi?
Yeah, well,
you can't update your Facebook status if
Yeah, I don't know. I thought that was funny. But he also, I noticed, has tried to do, in one of the earlier episodes, some similar sort of signposting like Serial, where he's like timing how long it took on the drive. And he's like, remember these later. They're going to be important. And so I thought it was interesting. I almost sort of could see where he was taking some of the narrative techniques that were so effective in Serial and sort of applying them to his own storytelling. But I have to say, this case was a case I really didn't want to learn anything about. But as I listened to the way that he has sort of introduced information on both sides and experts, I have come around.
Toby, what about you? Now, we've heard now that this trial, we don't know when it's going to start again. It could be months and months and months. And you've been listening to this podcast. Are you sad that we're not going to get any updates on this case and from this podcast, maybe for months?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's just kind of life. I really like the podcast. I think of all the sort of post-serial true crime podcasts, I think this is the strongest one. And I think part of it's the choice of the case. And I think part of it is he's done a very good job of approaching the case from a bunch of different angles, coming off as seeming pretty impartial. So I'll be less being sad that I'm not going to hear about it and more looking forward to when it does come back.
I'm looking forward to when it comes back too. I respect Bill Rankin's work a lot. I think that we're learning a lot about journalism. At the same time, we're learning about the court system. Kevin, what do you think? You disappointed? Are you looking forward to this podcast coming back?
I actually am kind of a little disappointed in the sense that I was really enjoying it and looking forward to hearing more about how the case was going to go. And, I thought this was like a really good opportunity for a podcast to be a little different, where it's a little more like the news, a weekly news roundup, and see, can you make that different than what you might get on the television or on a radio roundup? Can you do it different narratively? I really just want the best for that podcast.
Right. So, Kevin, our friend Bill Rankin has retired.
Yeah. By the way, did you notice, we've been very effusive of Bill's talents and what he's brought to it. You can hear, though, we didn't love every part of everything he did.
No.
Right? And so, just the fact that he was such a gentleman about those things, just speaks to his character. So,
yeah.
One of the greats.
Although I will say this podcast is memorable for me
in
many ways because, how many times do you accidentally drive one way when you mean to drive a different way? It sort of talks about that hypnosis you go into when you're in the car.
Yeah.
And there has been a big update in this case, right?
Yeah. So in 2022, Justin Ross Harris's case was overturned by the Georgia Supreme Court. And basically, they said all that stuff about his sexual activities was prejudicial. And so he was awarded a new trial. And then in 2023, the district attorney basically said without that evidence, they really couldn't proceed with murder charges. And he walked out of Macon State Prison in 2024.
Wow.
So anyway, it still remains a great question about whether this was an accident or whether this was premeditated murder, and either way, it's a tragedy.
It's a huge tragedy and a very interesting story that Bill unraveled here. All right, Kevin, does that do it for us?
Yeah.
Well, this show was recorded in Studio C, The Closet, in our New Hampshire basement, where the police also draw nefarious conclusions about our unconventional taste in digital erotica.
Pretty conventional, I thought.
On behalf of all the crime writers, thanks so much for listening. We will catch you later.
Boobs.
Partners in Crime Media.